everybody! I can't believe BookTube-A-Thon is already over. I did, however, have a really successful week. I managed to read 6 out of 7 of my books and 1,830 pages, so I was really impressed with that. So the first book I read was actually a book that wasn't specifically counted under a challenge because it was kind of the book to make up my 7 books challenge, as it were. However, it was also one of the last books I acquired along with the book that I actually was meant to be reading for that challenge. So for the sake of trying to complete as many challenges as possible, I'm counting this book as one of the last books I acquired. And that book was Entangled by Kat Clark. This is about a girl who wakes up in a white room. She doesn't have a clue how she got there, and all there is in this room is her bed, there is a bathroom, and there is a table, and on the table there are pens and paper, and she basically just sits down every day and writes about her life, things that have happened in her life. She doesn't have a clue how she got there, but it's basically giving her time to think about all the things that have happened to her over the past few years involving her friends, her boyfriends, her school, her family, etc. It was a really well written book. I really actually quite enjoyed it. I'm not a big fan of contemporary, so I wasn't sure how much I was going to enjoy it, but I really did. It is slightly predictable, but because it's being written by this girl after she has lived through these experiences, you sort of get the idea that you're meant to know what's going to happen, you're meant to guess what's going to happen to her, and in a way she's not a very likeable character at times, particularly because she's going through quite a lot of stuff. She acts out quite a lot, and sometimes you think she's going overboard and being really horrible to people, but because you can guess what's going to happen, you kind of feel sorry for her as well in a way, so it doesn't make her a dislikable character. I think it's a very clever device to do it that way, and it was really interesting, and although I did guess what was going to happen at the end, it was still an enjoyable book, and I gave it 3.5 stars. The second book I read was to read someone else's favourite book, and I went for The Sin Eater's Daughter by Melinda Salisbury. I really loved this. I initially really enjoyed it, and then the middle I was just sort of not sure about. There was stuff happening. There's a love triangle, and anyone who watches my channel knows that I'm not a big fan of those. But the conclusion of this book really brought me back, and I absolutely loved it. I cannot wait for the next book in the trilogy. It's basically about this girl named Twyla who is the Sin Eater's daughter. Unsurprisingly, the Sin Eater is someone who, when someone dies, they go and they consume all these foods which are meant to represent all their sins, and Twyla is the Sin Eater's daughter. She is meant to take on that mantle when her mother dies. However, one day the Queen comes along and tells her that she is Donan, I think that's how you say it, Donan unbodied, and Donan was the daughter of the 2 gods who the kingdom that she lives in pray to and, you know, adore. And she is basically taken to the castle where she lives. She's treated like royalty. However, she also has this sort of curse put on her in a way, being the daughter of these gods, or the embodiment of the daughter of these gods, and that means that anyone who touched her skin will automatically die. So she is used as an executioner by the royal family, and it's really dark, it's really twisted. The Queen particularly is a horrible character. She is shockingly bad, and one of the great things that I loved about this book is, despite the fact that Twyla she's an executioner, she kills people, she's killed like 13 people, it's horrible, but we feel sorry for her because the menace coming from the Queen and from the court is just even worse. I really love that side of it. It was really brutal. There's a lot of stuff that happens in this book which, you know, just is really like, whoa, but I really enjoyed it. The end in particular, as I say, is just amazing, and I cannot wait for the next book in this trilogy. The next book I read was to fulfill the challenge, read a book by an author with the same first letter as your last name. My last name begins with B, so I read My Second Life by Faye Bird. This is about a girl named Anna who can remember her former life as another girl named Emma, and when she was Emma she did something and it still haunts her to this day, despite the fact that she is this whole different person. However, one day she bumps into someone from her former life and everything just begins to unravel. It's a really interesting idea, it was a really interesting concept. The characters are very well written. I thought in particular there's a character in this called Francis from Anna's first life as Emma, and she's a very complicated character, and I didn't particularly like her. You're not really meant to like her. She was very twisted, very bitter as a result of everything that happened to her. It was just amazingly well written. However, I wasn't totally blown away with it because the whole concept of Anna being able to remember her former life, there's no explanation for this, and although the focus of this book really is very much on the realism and on the idea of family, this isn't a fantasy book, and as a result the whole reincarnation side of the story isn't really gone into. It's just sort of accepted by everyone that Anna was Emma once upon a time, and I don't know, I had an issue with that. I understand she didn't want to get into the fantasy side of it, but I felt kind of let down when there was no explanation, so I gave this 3 stars. The 4th book I read was for the challenge to read a book with blue on the cover, and I read The Bone Dragon by Alexia Casale. This I really loved. It's aimed at sort of early teens, I would say, and it reminded me a lot of Jacqueline Wilson's style of books. It's about this young girl who has been living with a new family. She was adopted, and she has been living with this new family for a few years, and all that time she's been hiding the fact that she has a cracked rib in her side. She won't talk about where it came from, she won't talk about how it happened, but she has this cracked rib. Eventually she tells her family and she is taken into hospital. She has an operation to get it fixed, and after the operation she is given the tiny little bone that they aren't able to recover, to retrieve, and with the help of her new uncle, her adopted uncle, she carves it into a dragon, and this dragon comes to life and basically helps her heal physically and mentally. It's an interesting idea. It does remind me, as I say, a lot of Jacqueline Wilson because it's kind of very dark matter. There's a lot of stuff about her actual family that she no longer lives with, which is alluded to throughout the entire book. One of my favourite things about this book is that she is so honest. This is a children's book, but she doesn't talk down to children. She just writes as if they are intelligent, which of course they are, and I wish more writers had done that when I was a kid. And I know that had I read this when I was, say, 12, I would have really loved it. However, as an adult, I did also really love it as well. So it was a really good book. I really enjoyed it, and I gave it 3.5 stars. The penultimate book I read was for the challenge read a book you really want to read, so I read Blood and Feathers by Lou Morgan. I absolutely loved this. It reminded me a lot of Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman's Good Omens. It's about the battle between good and evil. It's about angels fighting the fallen. There's this war going on. It's been going on for centuries, and they kind of constantly trying to keep the balance between good and evil. However, the balance is tipping towards evil, so the angels go to this girl named Alice, who is a perfectly normal person. She has had a perfectly normal life, but one day she comes home and discovers 2 angels in her living room and finds out that she's actually the daughter of an angel and a human, and as a result she is a half-breed, and this means that she has a series of talents in a way that make her useful to the war effort for the angels, and she becomes embroiled in it. I loved this book so much. It's incredibly well written. It's also hilarious, and as I say, it did remind me a lot of Good Omens, but that was largely because of the writing style. However, I have to say I enjoyed this more. I felt like the plot was stronger, and it's an incredibly visual book. I could imagine everything so vividly, but it is hilarious, and that humour really adds a certain amount of realism to these characters. Alice was a really interesting character. I loved following her. However, there are also some really interesting dynamics amongst the angels, and it was just really enjoyable, and I actually loved it so much I gave it 4.5 stars, and I rarely give books anything above 4 stars, so that says how much I love it. The final book I read, the 6th book I read, was to fulfill the challenge read a book without letting go of it, so I read Saga Volume 1 by Brian K. Vaughan and Fiona Staples. This is about 2 people who are from either side of a war, and they come together, fall in love, and have a baby together, and it's basically about their struggle to survive despite both sides trying to hunt them down. I was on the fence about whether I enjoyed this or not. I'd heard a lot of mixed reviews about it, and overall I did agree with those mixed reviews. It's a really interesting idea. When it's talking about them, I really enjoyed it. They're a really interesting couple, they're a really interesting dynamic, and there's this whole thing where they get a babysitter who is this dead ghost girl with half a body, and she is brilliant, she's hilarious, and I really enjoyed their storyline. However, there is this whole other storyline with some mercenaries, and I just didn't really care for that, especially because one of them ends up on this sort of sex planet and it's really bizarre. I don't know whether I'm going to read the next one in this series. I loved the artwork, and again it was a really interesting idea, but it didn't totally work for me, and I ended up giving it 3 stars. So those were the 6 books I read. I didn't get around to reading The City's Sun by Tom Pollock, however I will definitely be reading that this week, so I can't wait for that. Thanks to everyone who hosted the BookTube-A-Thon. I had an amazing week and it was great to take part in it. I did rather neglect BookTube this week, which rather goes against the ethos of BookTube-A-Thon, but I just really wanted to read as many books as I possibly could, so I'm glad I did that. However, I'm really sorry that I didn't really get to watch very many videos, and I didn't make any videos during this week because I was just so wrapped up in reading basically. But I had a great week. Thanks again to everyone who hosted it. If you took part in the BookTube-A-Thon, let me know in the comments below how you did, because I've really neglected and I missed seeing everyone's vlogs and everything. That is it for me today. I will see you again soon, but until then, bye!